Well, welcome everyone. It's a little bit after 2, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Christine Kiesinger, and I serve as Vice President of Development here at Studio B. And I want to warmly welcome you to our Meet Your Center interview series. We meet twice per month, every other Friday, and we've been doing this since late March. This interview series really emerged out of a course we quickly developed when COVID descended called Resilience and Steadiness. And we would end the week, each week, with a really esteemed professional, expert, a lot of different people from a lot of different fields and disciplines that are all in some way deeply, fiercely devoted to supporting personal and collective well-being. So before we begin today's conversation, I want to just take a moment, and I would like for each of you to just close your eyes and to take a very deep breath in. And as you exhale, just allow everything to just settle and relax as you come very fully into this space, leaving behind anything that's come before, worries about anything that's coming later. And I want you to just listen to this quote. I'm going to read it twice. And I just want you to reflect on what it means for you or what it might mean for you. When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. When I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I am afraid. What would it mean and how would it feel to use your strength in the service of your vision? And gently open your eyes, because we have someone with us who has done just that. She uses her strength in the service of her vision. And there's so much courage here, and there's so much strength here, and there is so much for us to learn. I want to formally introduce our guest. Dr. Monea Abdul-Majeed is a racial equity strategist, an anti-racism trainer and speaker. She leads organizations and wellness spaces to racial equity through training, strategy, and her 3R approach, which I am a huge fan of: reflection, relationships, and resilience. Dr. Monea is also a 500-hour registered yoga teacher in the Vinyasa style. She has been a dedicated student of yoga for 18 years, and she uses her knowledge of mindfulness to inform her racial justice work. She is a native of Washington, D.C. She lives in Pennsylvania with her husband and their 3 children. One of her most popular offerings is leading courageous conversations around race. And today we have a fascinating session for you because we're going to do just that. Dr. Monea and I will have a free-flowing conversation about anti-racism and leadership. So welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Christine. I'm so grateful to be here. It feels like a long time ago when we planned this, and the day is here. So welcome, Studio B, and thank you so much for having me.
You know, I first was introduced to you and your work through our founder and CEO, Jennifer Sarambuli. And then I got to experience one of your workshops you offered through My Yoga, hosted by my dear friends, Rachel and Ulysses Wilson. And my colleague, Paula Chaikin, was also at that workshop. And right after it happened, I texted Paula and I said, I would take any course this woman offered.
Oh,
powerful. And so I'm hoping that and I know that we will get a glimpse into your work, but I want to connect us back to the opening quote because In that workshop, you mentioned that quote, and it was so powerful. And then you mentioned it again in our conversation very recently. And when I think about that quote, Audre Lorde quote, I think about you because you really live this, what it means to be in service of one's vision.
Yes. So actually, when you started with meditation and you started with that quote, I felt that in my heart. I was like, oh, she's getting Audre Lorde, and, a lot of what I do is not easy work, but I do believe that it is of service and it has been my passion. And so it's just been, how we do this practice, we practice, and then this practice reveals more to us as we continue to practice. And for years, I compartmentalized my life. I had my life in the yoga studios, and then I had my racial equity work with organizations, the federal government, nonprofit. And when I was doing my advanced yoga training, I took a weekend on yoga philosophy with my yoga teacher. He's still my yoga philosophy teacher. And it became very clear to me that part of my practice was merging my world, and that I couldn't leave anti-racism out of the door. Sorry about this. And that I couldn't leave anti-racism out of the door. They had to come with me into the studio, because I know, and that our studios are a microcosm for what happens in our world. And so I pitched my ideas to a lot of studios, and really nobody was kind of feeling it at that time, except there was one studio in DC. I took a workshop, and she just coincidentally asked me, what do you do for a living? And I said, racial justice. And she said, can you come to my studio? And that was over 1.5 years ago. And since that time, I've been working with that studio in DC. I would go to DC. And then COVID hit, and not just COVID, but the murder of George Floyd. And then for the first time, studios began to awaken and began to call me for this work. And so this is the busiest I've ever been. And I am very humbled and very grateful for the opportunity to step deeper into my passion and serve others with the work that I do. So I do want to have this courageous conversation, Christine, but before we do, we have to set some guidelines. We have to have some container holding for this conversation. And so I want to just jump into sharing my screen. And typically we do start with meditation, but Christine has already taken that, so I don't even have to start there. But I'm just going to give you a taste of what it's like to have a courageous conversation. And this is not at all a full workshop with me. This is just a courageous conversation. And so always what you need, a journal, because we have our 3 R's. So we do some reflection, relationship, resilience, a cup of water, which you should have already, open mind and open heart. So back in the day, before COVID, when I used to do courageous conversations in the community, I would always do them in informal places. So we did a restaurant before, a coffee shop, a bookstore, because what we're trying to do is talk about race, which can sometimes be a little uncomfortable. And we're trying to talk about it in an informal environment, right? So that's why we did coffee shops and restaurants and many different things to just bring people together, gather, and hey, let's talk about race. And so that's what I want this to be. This is a virtual space, but grab your coffee, grab your water, grab your journal, make yourself comfortable. And as always, open mind and open heart is required for this work. So we're going to have a courageous conversation on this relationship between anti-racism and leadership. And as I work with organizations and I work with many different studios, I have just come to see that the leadership is the one kind of setting the tone for the commitment to anti-racism work. And it has actually been on my heart because I talk to people a lot. I talk to yoga students, I talk to yoga teachers, I talk to employees. A lot of people call me, and they're actually having a lot of trouble in organizations. And it's called institutional racism, but sometimes people don't have a name for it, but they come and they tell me and they share, and they're like, this happened at work, this microaggression or whatever. And so I started to think like how can I help these people? And it's like I can help those people, but I have to also talk to the leadership. so they can kind of understand like what's going on, because we know that organizations, studios are nothing without the people. And that includes all people, not just people of the majority, not just white people. That includes all of us. And so that's why I was like, well, Christine, like, let's just have this conversation about leadership, because obviously Christine is a leader and we all are leaders in a lot of ways. And so that's what we're gonna do. And so after we do a little bit of welcome stuff, we're gonna set the community agreements. And these community agreements come straight from the Courageous Conversation format and model. And do I have my book? Yeah, here it is. So Courageous Conversations, I didn't come up with it, but it's actually a book and it has a format. So I honor that format, and then we'll have our conversation. And at the end, we'll take some questions, right, Christine? Yeah, okay. So the first community agreement is to always breathe. So typically I would do a meditation. Christine has already done that. So what I'm gonna do is just talk about the power of the breath. So typically when we're talking about racism, people get uncomfortable, right? Nobody wants to talk about race. And so I always say to breathe throughout that conversation, just like our yoga practice. The breath is always with us, right? So if we get uncomfortable, we breathe. This calms the nervous system. This opens up the body so that we can be open to receive and have an open dialogue on race. So typically I start a workshop with a little bit of meditation, and this also grounds people into the present moment, just like we do in a yoga class. I encourage you to stay engaged. I understand there's so many competing priorities. You're at home, maybe your family. And when I say stay engaged, I want to see your face. Maybe you show your face on the screen and just allow yourself to be a part of community right now. Because in order for us to have a courageous conversation, we have to be connected. We have to trust each other. And even though we're virtual, we can look into each other's eyes and get a connection. You will experience discomfort. So I hate to ruin it for you, right? So I'm all into mindfulness, and that is my approach. But talking about race can be uncomfortable, and that's okay. That is a natural part of the process. In fact, it's great. It means that you're changing, that you're growing, that you're evolving. And maybe you are going deeper into yourself and you're discovering something that maybe you hadn't thought about before. And so this is great. When I think about a yoga class, I think about pigeon pose, right? You know how we say we're looking for that edge, that balance between sthira and sukha, that balance between challenge and ease. So this work is not going to be, painful, but it will be uncomfortable. It's going to push you to your edge. And that's what we need. We call that learning edge when we train. So the next one is to speak your truth. So typically when people are having a conversation, you could sometimes use like second person or third person. For example, you would say something like, when you're at the grocery store and you get bored and the line is long and you grab for a magazine. But in a courageous conversation, I encourage everyone to own their story. That means we use I statements. I think, I believe, I've experienced. So that means I was at the grocery store. I got impatient in a long line and I grabbed a magazine, right? So we're owning our story. We're being the experts of our own experience. And while this might sound small, this is a major piece to eliminating racism. Storytelling, sharing our stories, owning those stories. The next part of a courageous conversation is extremely important. And this is to listen for understanding. So we all like to think, I listen well, right? But this is active listening. This is not listening to respond, not listening to defend. I see that a lot, especially when we start talking about racism. Sometimes white people say, I'm not a racist. So automatically there's this defense that comes up. But we're not even listening to relate. Sometimes white women will say, well, I know what racism's like because I'm a woman, and they want to respond to connect and to relate. But listening for understanding means that we are allowing that person's view to be their own. We're not questioning it. We are trusting their story. And really, the only appropriate response is, thank you for sharing. I honor you for sharing, right? And I think this is extremely important, especially when Black, Indigenous people of color, that's the term now, BIPOC, when we start to share our stories, there's sometimes this dynamic of gaslighting, and people will say, oh, so-and-so didn't mean it, or, oh, you're being too sensitive, right? So listening for understanding means that when we share our stories, especially white people, are listening with understanding, not judging, not questioning, but listening to the story as we tell it and trusting it. So this listening for understanding evokes what we call perspective taking, which is very important to having a courageous conversation. The next guideline is honor confidentiality. So right now, I'm from DC, but I live in a very small Pennsylvania town. And I might see people at the grocery store, like everybody is so connected. But what we say here is, even though I'm on this Zoom and some people are in Wilkes-Barre, some people, you might be all over, we honor confidentiality. That means that we can take the lessons with us, but we leave the stories, because those stories they belong to the person who shared them. So we take the lessons, we leave the stories here. This one is a key one. Expect and accept non-closure. Now, this is often surprising because, especially after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, my DM, every inbox from all of my white friends was like, what can I do? I just want to end racism. And there was such urgency. And oftentimes people want to check the box. They might say, well, I'm just going to go to this workshop. I'm going to read this book and the problem will be solved. It doesn't work like that. Race and racism is one of the most complicated topics in United States history, going back to 1619. And so any workshop, any book, any podcast, there will be some non-closure. That means that we're not, after this, even this courageous conversation, we're not just sealing up the box and throwing it out and saying we're done. We're not checking the box. In a lot of ways, we're opening up the box, because this is a step along the journey. I say anti-racism is a marathon, not a sprint. It's a movement, not a moment. So this is a step along the journey. So you can't expect to have everything all done when you leave here. In a lot of ways, you might be awakened to some things you hadn't noticed about yourself when you leave here. And that's a natural part of this journey. In all of my workshops and my courageous conversations, I center the voices of Black, Indigenous people of color. And so what does that mean? It means that when we share stories, I'm holding space. I am centering the needs, the ideas, the voices of Black, Indigenous people of color. And this is difficult for a lot of us because we are in the United States, some people are in other countries, but we have this dynamic of white supremacy, which is just an ideology. It's not about skinheads. It is an ideology that white is right. And it is the sea we all swim in. So even if you are Black, Indigenous people of color, a person of color, this is the sea we swim in. And so we have to go against that sea, go against the tide to actually center Black, Indigenous people of color. And I noticed this especially in our yoga community. You know, when we think about yoga, we think of skinny white woman, right? Yoga journal. But what does it look like to center Black, Indigenous people of color? And so that's where I'm coming from in my approach, my quotes, you know, Audre Lorde, my graphics, everything. I'm trying to center us because that's a different experience for so many of us. And then lastly, when we have a courageous conversation, we have a responsibility to each other to uphold these agreements. And so while, you know, there's a lot of like calling out and all this stuff, we're not going to do that, but we can lovingly remind each other, hey, so-and-so, listen for understanding, or I just shared my truth and, you know, you were defensive. We can lovingly remind, because we're setting a community. We are making ourselves not a safe space, but a brave space, right? So we can be brave to remind our community members to respect these boundaries. And so these are just the guidelines for any courageous conversation. And I read them. And then I always say, and I'll say this to you today, if there's any other agreement that you need to make with this community to feel brave and empowered, you can drop that in the chat. And I'll add that. You can drop that in the chat. I'm watching. I think I'm watching. I don't know, Christine, if you have. Okay. Oh, thank you. All right. And if you think of something as Dr. Christine and I are talking, just let us know. Just let us know.
So Dr. Monea, right away, those agreements they're just fundamental principles of conscious communication. And I think can be applied to any difficult conversation. I mean, I think we could spend an entire hour just on one of those agreements. But I did want to point out that this session is simultaneously being broadcast live on Facebook. So I think that that's important for everyone to know. And part of our reasoning for doing that is so that this gets lots of reach. But in terms of confidentiality, and I just wanted to name that truth.
Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for bringing that up. And just so you know, when I have courageous conversations in the community, I typically do not record them for that reason, so that people can feel brave. Because when we talk about race, there's so much that comes up, you know, even generationally, people talk about my grandfather, my mom, and it's very vulnerable, but it has to happen in order to have a conversation. So I just want to say that thank you for bringing that up. And if you were to take a workshop with me, a courageous conversation, I uphold that principle so much that I do not record. So, all right. So another thing that I always do when I have a courageous conversation is that I share the guiding principles to doing this work. So if you come to any of my workshops, one of the guiding principles is that racism does exist. It's not a theory, it's lived experiences, and it's real, right? And so oftentimes, you know, the people who come to my workshops are not there to debate whether or not racism is real. They come because they know it's real and they want to do something about it. Which leads me to my next guiding principle, that if you're here, you wish to be a part of the change. You're willing to be uncomfortable and grow. Another one is that you're willing to take a risk. Now, this is extremely important to have a courageous conversation, because when we think about why do people not have conversations about race? They're afraid to say the wrong thing, and typically is rooted in fear. But here in a courageous conversation, you take a risk because you want to grow. So that means you might risk saying the wrong thing, but that's okay, because everybody makes mistakes in this work. And I teach a whole workshop on how to apologize when you say something and you didn't know, right? And so for a courageous conversation, we're willing to take that risk. You have pure intentions and you desire better impact. So rest assured, my yoga philosophy shares with me that we all have inner goodness. So when I do my work, I enter with the assumption that I'm in a room, even if it's a Zoom room, with good people. But they're with me because they want better impact. Because what I know is that good intentions are not enough. We have to have better impact as it pertains to anti-racism. Okay, so a lot of people, they want to convince, like, I'm a good person. We're all good people. I honor that. I believe that. But we could all have better impact, especially right now with everything going on in our world, and that you're committed to action. So the people who come, I always call them the change makers. They come to my trainings because that means they're committed to action. And I think you've already heard so much about me, but this is me all over again. And this is my why. I have a family that I love. And I want to say that I do this work for the people I serve. And I do secondarily, but my family is really what inspires me to keep going, because I envision this world where it's probably not going to be in my lifetime, but maybe one of their lifetimes, that I don't have to worry about my husband if he goes for a run, right? Or I don't have to worry about my children going to a school being the only Black child, or, you know, so I'm envisioning something for them and for the future. And even if that doesn't happen in my lifetime, I get joy, and I feel that I'm being of service, that I am adding to that mission. So I want to get a chance to know you a little bit if you're here. So I want to know your name and pronouns. You can put that in the chat, then your location. And I also want to know whose land you're resting on, right? So when we talk about Black Indigenous, we're talking about people of the land. And so I'm going to put in, just as just a little fun thing, I'm going to put in the land finder, and you are going to find the Indigenous people whose land you're resting on. It's a really cool thing. All right, so I'm putting it in the chat. So all you need to do is click on it, put your city and your state, and then tell us whose land you're resting on right now. So mine is Susquehanna. It's yeah. Test it out. And this is just a way to honor that there were people on this land before us, before us. And oftentimes we don't learn about this. Let's take some time to honor. I see them coming in. Thank you so much. Very nice. South Carolina. Very nice. So let them keep coming in. That's really cool. I love to see that. And so, Dr. Christine, we're going to start having our conversation. So we already set the container, and I run an online school called Authentic Antiracism. And the Authentic Antiracism approach includes the 3 R's: reflection, relationships, and resilience. And so we're going to do that today, right? I want you to reflect. When you see, the land, go ahead and reflect and just call that to mind. And then, another question for reflection right now is, what is leadership to you? Maybe you pull out your journal and just kind of write that. Like, what does leadership mean? Like, what does being a leader mean to you? Yeah, and I hope you will continue to write. Oh, wow, UK. Continue to write on that. And our second R is relationships. So this is where Dr. Christine and I, we just start talking. We just model a courageous conversation through relationship. So Dr. Christine, like I shared, I have this passion now for working with leaders as it pertains to anti-racism. Mm-hmm. And we agreed that we would just, kind of have a conversation about it. So it just feels important. And when I say leaders, I'm talking about, CEOs and owners of studios. I'm also talking about teachers. Mm-hmm. Now I'm running a training program called Level Up with 45 yoga teachers, all leaders. And I think that it's important when we are thinking about leadership, because I thought about what makes a good leader and why do people follow certain leaders? Well, they follow certain leaders because they feel in alignment with that leader's mission, but also that leader gives them hope. And so I started to think about, like, right now, everything that's going on in our world, we need our leaders to give us some hope. But oftentimes leaders are giving hope to a certain group of people, and it does not include all Black, Indigenous people of color, because oftentimes they shied away from anti-racism. And so that's where I'm at right now. So I'm really looking to work with organizations, starting with leaders. Mm-hmm. What has been your experience with working with leadership?
That it's very different now. And what leaders need in terms of training and development is very, very different. It's the old ways have fallen away and no longer apply. And so one of the things that I'm finding that's really critical now in leadership is trust. And if I'm not able to establish trust between myself and others in my organization, especially now, it's going to make leadership very, very difficult. And that the trust piece isn't something that comes through necessarily in my doing, but it comes through in my being. And so the embodiment of certain qualities of leadership, I think, matter more than they ever have before. And how do you show up in a forum like this? And even before you open your mouth, you're the leader, and you're creating a certain kind of environment for something to happen that's going to move everyone forward, everyone. So, again, it's not just about what you convey through emails, text messages, any sort of written, even necessarily what you say, but who you are, and the showing up in a certain way. And when I was thinking about leadership, courage, these conversations, and race, one of the questions that I have for you, because I've been thinking a lot about this, is what qualities of being do you believe or do you see should be present in order to lead with courage, which is to communicate with courage, which is to create community with courage, which is to address race and race equity with courage?
Right. So I think that kind of starts with the definition of courage, right? So the definition would be the ability to do what scares someone, right?
Mhm.
I'd say it's the willingness.
Mhm.
And, right now, what I'm seeing in the organizations that I'm working with is when leaders are willing to say they do not know,
Yes.
they are willing to learn. And so there has to be a humility. So
Mhm.
when I go into organizations, typically it's kind of like this. A CEO, and they could own a yoga studio, or they could own a nonprofit, even a law firm I've worked with. And they'll say, after the murder of George Floyd, we just need you to come in to talk to our staff, to train our staff. And sometimes I've done those things, and I just go in and train their staff. And then their staff will say, well, I don't know if my manager even supports me, because especially the Black and Indigenous people of color, because my manager's never had a conversation with me. There's been the obligatory, like in a meeting, like, are you okay? But that wasn't a real sincere type of humility. And so when I'm thinking about leadership and this relationship between anti-racism, I'm thinking about white leaders. And I'm thinking about this necessity of humility to bring in outside resources and have the change start with you. Because oftentimes if a leader starts just with the staff, it needs to be bottom up and top down. So everybody's getting the same amount of information. I understand a lot of leaders are busy. So even some of the studio owners that I work with, they're like, I'm scrambling, just trying to keep the doors open because of COVID-19. How can we do this training? And they have, had people donate, and they have found a way, but it always works better when the leader is actually at the training too, or when I do executive coaching just with that leader. And there's so much humility required, because a lot of times anybody, whether you're a leader, and all of us are leaders of something, but there's never been that reflection on, like, what does it mean, especially for white people? What does it mean to be white? Like, what is my racial identity? And am I really white, or like, am I German, Irish, Jewish, like all these different things? And so that takes humility to think back to the racist grandfather that maybe said you couldn't play with so-and-so because that child was Black. Or, I mean, these painful things that people like to keep buried, because, and I'm going back to humility, because I've had leaders say to me, like, I can't say I don't know, because if I say I don't know, then people won't trust me, because they think that there's an expectation that they have to know everything. But with the humility comes, you know what? I don't understand what's going on right now in the world, right? George Floyd was the first time I've ever experienced or seen like acute racism in my life. I need some help. What can I do, right? And so that's hiring consultants, but it takes a level of humility to really step into that courage. And that humility also has to be transparency, vulnerability.
Mhm.
Oftentimes as leaders, we think that these are like soft skills, but this is the way. This is the way. Like, try to get a job done without these things, and people will not follow you. There'll be no trust.
Mhm.
And so that's why I think it's very important for leaders to humbly say they don't know, get the resources, and build that trust.
Yeah, and this idea of the leader or the executive being part of the training, their presence there, and they're not just sitting there on the sidelines observing, they are actually participating, is so valuable to the team.
Mhm.
And to share, as you said, to share openly about the grandfather and these qualities of vulnerability and empathy and humility are all qualities that we find ourselves cultivating in our mindfulness practices, right? And so even before COVID and everything else that's happened since then, increasingly seeing more and more literature on, what makes for an extraordinary leader, the presence of these very qualities that, as you said, are often considered the soft skills, but they're the essential skills.
Yes.
And without them, you know, there's no connection, there's no trust, there's no sense of collaboration, there's no sense of co-creation. I just want to know that in some way, that we're two human beings, and that we have experiences to share, and we have experiences that we can learn from each other. But I really agree with you on starting with that executive team or that
Yeah.
executive, whether it's through the coaching or having that person present in the training. So valuable.
Absolutely. And I also think that, in terms of leadership, we have to broaden our definition, because some people think, oh, just because I don't run a business or I'm not a CEO, I'm not a leader. But if you are, especially a yoga teachers are leaders. People come to yoga classes and they look up to their yoga teachers. They're coming for something. And if people are looking up to you, you are a leader. It could be even in your home, if you have children or a spouse or whatever. And I think that when we broaden that definition of leader, we take more responsibility, right? Versus the diffusion of responsibility. Because if something goes wrong, people always want to blame somebody else or blame the CEO. And so I think that we really do have to embrace that, especially in the yoga community, because I look at the yoga community right now as being at the forefront of what needs to shift in our world, as it pertains to anti-racism, mindfulness, healing, restoration. Even right now, what's going on politically, a lot of people are saying, like, this is our time to restore. This is our time. And I'm like, yeah, we've been saying this in the yoga community for years, but it's time for the yoga community to dismiss the spiritual bypassing and really see that what's going on in the world shows up in the studios, and we have to be aware and we have to confront that. One other thing you said about, just being another human being. I remember there were times when I was younger and I would see the leader and I'd be like, oh, that's the leader. Like, I can't say this or that. And then when leaders are vulnerable, it does connect you because you see the deepest humanity of them. And a lot of what I'm training in my anti-racism approach is about seeing the humanity in Black, Indigenous people of color. Because slavery, capitalism, the exploitation of African labor was all about extracting the humanity from Black, Indigenous people of color. And so a lot of my approach is saying, hey, let's go back to honoring the humanity of every human being. And so I think that's a key point when you just mentioned that in terms of the humanity piece, that really resonated with me as it pertains to anti-racism.
Something I want to ask you about, I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of leadership, because again, you can be a leader in any kind of environment. I recently wrote a blog for Studio B on parenting, conscious parenting through COVID. And one of the tips that I gave was for parents to ask their children for feedback very humbly, very authentically. And I was really thinking about this idea that we're always giving feedback to our kids as leaders, right? As leaders of the family. But when do we sit with our children and say, hey, how am I doing? You know, I want to create this environment where you can give me feedback. And I might not like what you're going to say, or it might feel uncomfortable, but the idea that a leader in an organization might create a similar type of environment where we can freely offer feedback. Just imagine what kind of organizational culture that might create, and the energy of that culture, that climate. And why are we so afraid of feedback?
Yeah, because, we are perfectionism. We love to be perfect. Like I said, a lot of leaders I work with, they say that, I can't tell people I don't know. I remember a teacher said that I can't tell people I don't know. And so we are afraid of feedback because we want to be perfect. And oftentimes when I teach about white dominant culture, I teach that perfectionism is a part of that, right? This thing that we have to, because remember, we're talking about, I have to do more, I have to be more, I have to work harder. Like all of these are the traits that we get from this history of slavery, when how hard we worked equaled our value. So we're so stuck in that we're oftentimes, aiming for perfectionism versus appreciation of where we are and acceptance of where we are. And so I think that is why leaders are reluctant to get feedback. And, I'm a leader, and I just remember just a recent example of the power of feedback. So I'm doing this course called Level Up, and it's 6 weeks long. And after week 3, and it's like 7 to 9 at night. So after week 3, I was like, let me do a midpoint survey. And all throughout, I had been like up all night, like getting my slides already, like trying to make everything all perfect. And I know I'm recovering from perfectionism. And when I asked for feedback, the students said, we just want to talk to each other more. We don't like, now we understand race, racism, white fragility, white dominant culture, white supremacy. Like, you've given us the shared vocabulary. We just want to talk more. So as a leader, I'm like, well, that's easier for me, right? Like, I don't have to like come out and pull out my PhD. Like, I just need to hold space. But I would have never known that unless I asked for feedback. And so yesterday when we met, we had a really good session. We did some caucusing. So that means that we broke people up according to race, and then we came back together. So that means that for the Black, Indigenous people of color, the question was like, what do you wish that white people would stop doing? And that is harmful. And then our white group, the question was, what are you confused about in your interactions with Black, Indigenous people of color? And then we came together and we were able to discuss, but I literally had maybe 2 slides. And typically when I'm training, I have like a million slides, but unless I would have asked for feedback, I wouldn't have known how people were doing. And so I think it's very, very powerful. And it also shows that I care. And I think for leaders, getting that feedback shows that they actually care about the people that they're leading and the people they're serving.
I think part of that dynamic is that the leader facilitates and encourages feedback because we tend not to want to give it. We're afraid of giving it. If you're going to set up this sort of dynamic in your home with your children, you've got to set the environment in such a way that they're not afraid, which takes us back to what it means to have a courageous conversation, and what it means, or what it might mean and look like to learn how to have a courageous conversation at a young age.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And as you were sharing that about this feedback model, I think is extremely important, because I thought back to the definition of racial equity, right? So when I work with organizations, the goal is like racial equity. So that means changing policies and procedures in the organization to make things more equitable racially. So that means that race has no relationship with outcomes. But racial equity is an outcome, but it's also a process. And the process is including the voices of those most directly impacted by institutional racism in every decision that you make. So you can't include those voices unless you ask for feedback, right? So it just connected the dots there. Like, if you want to have racial equity, in a lot of organizations, they'll hire me to do a racial equity plan. And I say, well, in order to do a plan, we have to assess. I have to talk to people. I have to see how they feel, because those voices are going to be embedded into this plan. And so it has to be a feedback model. And sometimes if people are uncomfortable receiving feedback, it's okay to hire a third party or a consultant to come in on your behalf, and especially an objective one, because they can take some of the edge off, and just give you the feedback anonymously of what people are saying. And I think that that's a great place to start if leaders are intimidated or too busy, and that can be a place to start, and that will lead to more courageous conversations.
Mm-hmm. I think about when I sort of map out my own model of what conscious communication looks like. I recently added a fifth element, and the fifth element is that the communication is momentum driven. Even if it's a hard conversation, there's this sense that I enter into it with the vow within myself, or the commitment that it will take us somewhere, and that somewhere is forward. And so I think part of the way to frame feedback, if you're a leader and it's not happening, is I would like for us to talk to each other in ways that is momentum driven. You know, much like coaching communication should be momentum driven. And that really changes it. For me, that takes the fear out of giving feedback. If I know that I'm giving feedback to my leader because my leader wants to drive things forward relationally, professionally in the organization, I feel more inspired. But I do think it's on the leader to start creating that kind of environment. And the same would be true as a parent, right?
Right. It's so funny you mentioned that, because I've done organizational climate research, right? And so part of my process for organizational climate research as it pertains to racial climates is not just talking and focus groups. We have to do that, but we also do some quantitative data where we have a survey or questionnaire and people answer questions. And one of the questions we always put is, do you believe that things will change in your organization as a result of this survey? And most people say no.
Wow.
So it goes back to what you said, like the leader has to be committed to that change, because people are not going to give you their feedback. And I spent 16 years at US Census Bureau, and we just had a decennial, and people aren't going to like give you all the information unless they think that things can change, and they see that link. They see how filling out this survey is going to change their bottom line. It's going to affect the quality of their life. And so that's what we're doing with racial equity. When we're getting people's feedback, we're saying, no, we are going to have a racial equity plan. This will make you feel more comfortable at work. You'll be okay. Because here's the thing, after George Floyd, Black, Indigenous people of color the next day were expected to go to work and perform as if nothing happened. And any human being who saw that video was traumatized. I mean, I couldn't even watch it again after I watched it the one time. And I remember the very next day, my email, everything was blowing up, because I have a part-time job and I do this work. And they wanted me to perform. They wanted me to do all this stuff. And I'm like, wait a minute, I get what happened, but I'm processing right now. Like I have to take this in for a moment, right? And there are a lot of Black, Indigenous people who felt the exact same way, that they were just expected to just perform as soon as, like the day after George Floyd. And I think that, things need to change. Organizations need to have a plan in place for when something happens. How do we hold space for our employees? Because a lot of organizations were in reactive mode, posting things on Facebook, trying to, issue statements, but they had not done the work within. And the work within is a plan. So that when something happens, we can be proactive in our approach, have courageous conversations, know how to hold space for all employees. And I just don't mean even Black, Indigenous employees, but white employees too. Like, how are we showing up in the workplace? Because we have to work together. And that needs to be a part of the plan. And I've even heard now that, things are virtual, there are a lot of people who were able, especially Black, Indigenous people of color, were able to go to work and come home, right? Go to work, come home, they're safe, they can rejuvenate. But now home and work are together. Mm-hmm. Right. So your laptop, so you're not getting a real break from like, okay, I got to go be with my coworkers. Like it's all together. And not only that, but it's even more intimate, because you can see where you're like in someone's home now, you know what I'm saying? And so I think that as it pertains to like what we're saying, there has to be a plan in place. It requires conversation, and it does require change. And the one thing I'll say is that when organizations hire me, I always say that I'm not a diversity trainer. I'm not cultural competency. I have a lot of respect for those models, but diversity is just about awareness of our differences and celebrating them. So we have like diversity fairs and we eat different foods, and then cultural competency is giving people the tools, right? So maybe you put everything in different languages. But anti-racism is about shifting power, privilege. And so that means that we're going to have to change policies and procedures. So there's a commitment to change when we start talking about anti-racism. And people get intimidated, but I say, well, wait, we can just make a few changes, right? So let me just think, one example, like one small change that a company can make. And this was actually a company I worked with yesterday. They decided to have a electronic anonymous like issues box, that if something happens in the workplace, and this is a small workplace, this is a company with 18 people, someone says something, they can submit it to this box. Their diversity and inclusion board will keep up with that box. And then they will bring the people together, have a courageous conversation, and bring an outside consultant to hold space for that. But just something like that. It was just like, okay, this organization, when I worked with them for 3 weeks, there were a lot of microaggressions coming up. They needed a way to deal with them. But that's a change, that's a policy, that's a procedure, right? So it doesn't have to be like this big thing. Some organizations need a lot of big change, but we can put some small changes in, and then that builds trust. People will give us more feedback because they know that the organization will change as a result of them being courageous enough to share their opinions, their experiences without fear of being fired or fear of not getting a promotion or whatever. So I think that's very important.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's an invitation then for everyone to proactively play a role in creating a particular kind of climate in the organization that is going to feel better for everyone to live in. And when that is a collaborative effort, then I invest more in the organization. You'll get the optimal work from me. I feel more connected. And you're right, that very small shift can create lots of shifts in that climate. I would be remiss if I did not just briefly open up for a couple of questions, because we're almost at 2:55. And if anyone would like to ask a question, I'm inviting you to unmute yourself. I lost track of the time.
I did too, Christine.
Anyone?
Hey, Monea, it's Mindy.
Hi, Mindy. How are you?
Good. It's good to see you.
You too. Hey, B.
So something that often comes up in these courageous conversations with other leaders, or even with, if you are the leader and with other people, is that common term or statement that I've heard so many times of, I'm not racist. Like, people get offended, right? Like, I don't have a racist bone in my body. I don't see color. So what is your advice on how to respond to that?
Mm-hmm. So, this whole thing of colorblind, it just doesn't help. But because we do need to see color, and we do see color. So stop saying you don't see color. But I think that what happens is there's a lot of stigma to actually like, I'm not a racist, versus actually examining racism itself. So the way that I kind of look at this is like, that's a label, right? But what is racism? And so within my workshops, we go through that definition. And in fact, I had it as a slide because a lot of times it's just that stigma with that word, but people haven't even defined what race or racism is. So racism is racial prejudice plus power equals racism. So racial prejudice is what people are sometimes saying they're not, because that means I'm a nice person. Because when people say I'm not racist, what they mean is I'm nice in the yoga community. I'm vegan. A Black friend. I'm not mean to Black people, right? But that's racial prejudice. Power equals racism. So power, laws, policies, procedures. And so in order for someone to be racist, they have to have racial prejudice, and then they have to also uphold laws, policies, and procedures that are inequitable. And so whenever people share that with me, I encourage them to like, let's break down racism. And to be quite honest, the way I look at it is, we have 3 forms of racism: interpersonal, internalized, and systemic racism. And we're all swimming in this sea of racism, including Black, Indigenous, people of color. When I taught Level Up, people said, should the Black teachers come? I'm like, yeah, because a lot of times we're perpetuating such inequality because we don't know better, right? And so all I'm saying is, if you want to go the opposite way, you have to be strategic. You're not going to be an anti-racist just by saying that. Like, there has to be some strategy. You have to be doing something to unlearn these systems of oppression that we have been born into. So I don't know a whole lot of people that can say like they're not, like even my own self. I'm like, how am I participating in this inequity, and what can I do differently, right? And part of it for me is being silent. If I don't say something, then I am perpetuating, a racist system. But by saying something, I'm going against that. So when people say that to me, I just say, let's look at your strategy, right? I know you're not racist. And remember, I started this courageous conversation by saying that I acknowledge everyone's inner goodness. Everyone has pure intentions, but impact is what I'm looking at, right? So I think it goes back to that question. But yes, I often, when people are like, I'm not a racist, I'm like, well, let's look at what this means, So
I want to leave on this note.
Okay.
This idea of good intentions. It reminds me of Brene Brown's acronym BRAVING, which is all about trust. She takes the word braving, and these are the qualities of trust that need to be in place in order for people to trust interpersonally and even to trust yourself. But the G of braving means generosity. And what she says is, I always believe I enter into every encounter with the generosity of spirit that is such that I assign good intentions to you, and even to a behavior, something that you may have done that in other words, I don't automatically go to, you're a horrible person, you're evil, why did you do that? But I automatically assign a generosity of spirit, good intentions. And then sometimes, until we're proven differently, right? But tell me just briefly, or tell us, how does that change a dynamic between 2 people?
What you mean, generosity?
Assigning good intentions to
okay, yeah.
So I enter into this dialogue with you with a generosity of spirit, within which I believe, I trust that your intentions are in your goodness. I trust in your goodness.
Well, for a lot of the trainings that I do and the people that I'm in contact with, they like my approach because that's how I come in. I don't come in like trying to convince, because again, one of my basic principles to myself is that I would never treat anyone how, white supremacy treats me or how racism treats me. And so I'm coming from a place of power sharing, not power hoarding. And so when I'm coming in saying, I'm honoring everyone's inner goodness, I feel even safer, because I know that the people who sign up for my trainings are not there to harm me. They are not there, they're there to learn. But if I come in thinking that all white people are bad and all this stuff, like I can't even do my job. And not only that, but I can't even be a part of the change. So, so for me, that's empowering. That's why I do my work. And I'm often, because I believe in people's inner goodness, I just believe that that's who I attract. I've had some difficult people in my workshops that, had different views, but I model what it looks like to disagree while keeping the person's humanity and dignity intact, right? We can disagree, but you don't have to be a horrible person. I don't have to be a horrible person. And I want to just share, I know we're coming up at 3, so I just have one more part of our 3R conversation, which is, oh, this is my resilience tool. Like she said, when I dare to be powerful, to use my strength in the service of my vision, then it becomes less and less important whether I'm afraid. And part of my, resilience model is also ongoing work. And I want to invite everybody here to do some more work with me. I am super excited that I will be having a free webinar on leadership and anti-racism. And this is actually going to be for everybody. So what happened was when I did Level Up, I've been doing trainings for a long time, but Level Up was the first one that I did as part of my new online school called Authentic Anti-Racism. And it was just for yoga people. And then people were like, well, what about everybody else? So I want to launch something, but I'm just going to start something free. And this one is called, it's about what we talked about, anti-racism and leadership, because I believe that resilience with this work is like, you have to keep going. You never arrive, right? As it pertains to anti-racism, it's always some work to be done. And so you can sign up. This is going to be on December 11th. And you can sign up and come join me just to do more work and to see a little bit more of what I'm about. And
thank you. And I strongly recommend it. Again, I was able to take one of your workshops and it was amazing. And this session was really wonderful. And I really thank you. And just your willingness to put the slides away and have this conversation, right?
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity. And thank you to Studio B for the work that you're doing.
And I'll make sure that the link to the workshop also goes into our, when we post the recording, which will be in a blog about this session.
Oh, okay. That's nice. Oh, now people are showing their faces. Hello, everybody out there. Thank you for tuning in.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for spending your afternoon with us. This was a really productive, fruitful, courageous hour. And again, Dr. Monea, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Christine.
We hope to see lots more of you.
I hope so, right? Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take good care.